Good evening, everybody. I'm a bit anxious now after that whistle tour so fast by Agnes how fast I'll have to speak. But I hope to, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to speak with everybody this evening to kind of share, I suppose, a very brief overview of work that we're engaged in DCU. And the project overall, I suppose, or the kind of, there's two projects, I suppose, that we're involved in that we have kept kind of talking about epilepsy. And they're essentially about communication, but within and external to the family context. Particularly about how families and children and parents speak to others about their condition, and also how they communicate within the family, and then the impact that this has on the wellbeing of children and their parents. Okay, so just to kind of, I suppose, kind of very briefly give kind of I suppose, the aims and objectives of what we set out to do. Where did the idea come from, I suppose, first in terms of thinking about, kind of disclosure and talking about communication? My interest, I suppose, from my nursing years in terms of my research is in kind of healthcare communication in a general sense. But where did the idea, I suppose, come from looking at this in epilepsy was related to, I suppose, education and teaching children's nurses about various conditions, and reading around the literature, and this kind of came up as that disclosure apprehension was, it was an apprehension for children and young people living with epilepsy in terms of sharing their diagnosis with others. And then we engaged with our clinical partners at Temple Street Children's University Hospital, and we talked around these issues in terms of are these challenges, are they real life challenges that children and parents experience. And they were, so we decided we would develop projects around these. So the first project was specifically to look at what we talk about, the concept of disclosure. So children or young people telling or not telling others outside their family that they have epilepsy. The aim here is specifically to look at what disclosure strategies children and parents use and their experiences of that. And then to look specifically to see if there's any relationship between the different disclosure approaches that children or families use to stigma, to their attitudes to their illness or their condition, to quality life, and also to other demographics like clinical demographics, seizure type. And then the second project leading on from that, we thought we'd look within the context of the family. And this kind of stemmed on, I suppose, from looking at disclosure external to the family unit, because when we were exploring that work and the literature around it, we identified like a concept called stigma coaching or stigma coaches. And this could be like lots of different people and different other people's perceptions about epilepsy and the condition, and obviously the home environment and the family and the context that children grow up as well as the developmental theory around that and how influential the home environment is. So we decided that we would take a second strand and look specifically at the family context as well. So similar experiences, but looking at communication approaches that are used within the context of the family. And the parent and child experiences of those communications, and then also again the relationships of that to stigma, quality life, illness, attitudes, and seizure type. So how did we do both of these studies? We use similar to what kind of Agnes spoke about in her study, kind of a mixed method design. So we kind of went through, I suppose, three specific stages. The first one, which is highlighted there, is a systematic literature review. So this here is where we reviewed any previous work or literature that was done kind of in the field of communication or disclosure, particularly from children and young people's experience. I suppose what we wanted to find out from this literature is, well, what do we already know about this subject, or what has been written about it? And okay, what do we not know? And therefore this would kind of guide us towards what we exactly wanted to explore in our research further. What we found from those two reviews, one which focused specifically on disclosure practices of children and young people and their parents, and the second one looking at family communication, that there was very little research or study done at an international level on both of these topics. While some work had been done exploring children and young people's experience of living with epilepsy, and within those studies there was some reference made to kind of the disclosure apprehension or not wanting to tell other people about their condition, but actually the topic itself was not investigated on its own. So that kind of provided, I suppose, a good basis or the rationale for us to proceed with the first phase of the study, which was what we call a qualitative phase or qualitative data. And this here is where we look at interviews. So we wanted to engage directly with children and their parents to get their experiences, of telling or not telling others about their condition. This involved interviews with 34 families, so we had 33 children aged between 6 and 16 years and 40 of their parents who took part in interviews with us. This data, when we analyse it, then we look at all of that data from the interviews and see what the main concepts or the main themes were to come out of those, and that then led us to help us develop our questionnaire, which was the next phase, which is our quantitative data. And this is where we're trying to quantitate so we can get a bigger sample by doing a survey. Larger numbers, and therefore we're trying to quantify the information that we get. In this, we used a lot of different instruments that were already out there, but one of the challenges we had, because communication and disclosure haven't been looked at before in an international level, we had no instruments or measures to actually measure those variables or those kind of key concepts which are the main things that we want to look at. So we actually had to develop some measures or communication kind of scales ourselves to be able to measure those. And then we compared them with already existing looked at the associations of those with existing measures in stigma, quality of life, and attitudes to illness that were already out there and valid instruments for within epilepsy. So for the questionnaire, we had 72 parents respond and 47 children complete them. And the children in this phase were aged 8 to 18 years. And that the kind of, I suppose, the age group for the second phase was influenced by the first phase and also by, I suppose, the complexity perhaps of the questionnaires for children to be able to complete them, and young people. In that sample, we had, say, 25 parent-child dyads. So what that means is from the same family, we had a parent and child from the same family in 25 cases. And we would look separately at that information or data as well. So then finally, I'll just talk a little bit about some emergent findings, because I can't go into much, but just to give you some sense of what was coming back from that data. I'll talk a little bit about knowledge dissemination exchange, in other words, what our next plan is, intervention development, and some thoughts on future research. This is kind of just one slide about, I suppose, thinking about what the children, young people and parents spoke about. And families talk about epilepsy in many different ways. I suppose that's the first thing to highlight, that they use in terms of disclosure strategies or approaches that they use in communicating with others outside the family, but also in communicating within the family. Lots of different approaches and strategies across the families. There's also many factors that influence communication, and they're not limited to what the ones I've listed here, but I've just pulled out some kind of briefly as a kind of, I suppose these were kind of a lot of the core main ones that struck us. The first one, which was actually clearly evident in Katie's video that was shown at the start, which was about normalisation, and wanting to live a normal life and not wanting to be seen as different. And this was a reason for not telling sometimes others about their condition, because they didn't want people, to see them as different because of their epilepsy. The hidden invisible nature of epilepsy was something that was key and perhaps different to other conditions in the literature, is that they said that because unless you have a seizure in public, you can actually keep your epilepsy hidden. So that was a reason why I don't need to tell anybody. Not wanting to cause worry was an interesting concept, and this was emerging for both parents and children. It was very much about family communication, in that children didn't want to worry their parents, or parents didn't want to worry children by actually opening up a conversation and didn't want to dwell on their condition. Lack of knowledge and information and difficulty in understanding and explaining epilepsy were obviously core topics. This was both from the parent's perspective and the child's, in terms of themselves first understanding their diagnosis, having to learn about epilepsy themselves, about the specific type of epilepsy or the specific type of seizures they had, and then being able to actually educate or explain those to other people as well was very challenging. A core finding across all of the data was attitudes, perceptions, reactions to epilepsy among all stakeholders. This is where children and parents talked about themselves, their own attitudes, their own perceptions, the perceptions of their parents, the perceptions of significant others such as teachers or people, their friends that they engage with, the public and the media. And then the final thing that came out, I suppose, as a reason for key, perhaps, telling others about it, was core issue was about safety. So to tell others, because if I have a seizure, then other people will know what to do. And the protection and supervision side of things could have been, a kind of a positive, I suppose, influence, but it also could be negative, because a lot of children spoke about, if they had told everybody or teachers informed, then that people sometimes became hyper vigilant, kind of watching them all the time and over supervising and over protecting. So there was kind of a balance there to try and achieve that. So they were mostly from all of our qualitative data, which we've pretty much finished analysing. And then from the quantitative data, where we're trying to look, is there any relationship between the communication and disclosure with stigma and illness, attitude, self-perception and quality of life for children. We're just kind of finalising those results, but there does look like there is some associations, with that for example, if you are more open in your communication, that you would have less perceived stigma. Your illness attitude might be more positive, your self-perception may be more positive, and overall you would have an enhanced quality of life. There are kind of things. And we're also looking there across to see the relationship between stigma feelings or perceptions in parents and stigma feelings and perceptions in children. So the main conclusions, I suppose, just on today's presentation is to kind of recognise that the impact of living with epilepsy extends beyond seizure management and looks at psychosocial wellbeing as well. And I suppose that's the core focus of our research, is to look at communication and disclosure and the impact that it has on psychosocial wellbeing. How communication impacts on wellbeing of children and their parents is under-researched internationally, and therefore this Irish research makes a substantial contribution to knowledge, particularly around disclosure experiences and family communication processes. And I suppose for me, what it has highlighted over the course of the research is the complexities, of the communication processes within the family and external to the family. And they're not necessarily, one approach it may not necessarily be any better than the other approach. It's very much related to a situational context. What we're hoping to do with this, information and further, we have published some work from this and we will continue to publish work, but to thinking about informing or how we could inform some communication-based or psychosocial intervention for children and families living with childhood epilepsy to help around the communication or the disclosure and kind of, I suppose, thinking about those core issues. As a start to that, the next thing we're starting to do, and we've just got some more funding to do this, is to try and translate all of the information that we've learned from these projects into a web-based platform with embedded learning resources, and we're going to establish what we call a community of practice. And a community of practice is to develop to get a group of people together that are experts within epilepsy, within communication, disclosure practices, that will include parents, that will include children, to actually help us design and develop some of these learning tools and resources to share some of the findings that we've come and the cases and the stories that we've heard about over the course of the research. And finally, just to kind of say that sometimes, these projects, we learn a lot more about just what we set out to do when we're asking the questions for communication. And there's a lot more things about, I suppose, other challenges and other daily experiences that children and young people and their families experience that come and we hear about in the research, and that enables us to develop further research projects. For example, one of the areas that we're looking to explore, to develop into, is youth and wellbeing at time of school transition, because that was a kind of a core issue again that came out in terms of our research. Okay, thank you.